皆様お待たせいたしました。
Thank you very much for waiting. Now we would like to start or resume the session 2 of the International Symposium, Revision 2014, Global Energy Turnarounds and Japan's Path. In this afternoon session, session 2, which is entitled The Distributed Energy Changes to the Market, we are joined by Mr. Eric Martineau, Senior Policy Advisor, Japan Renewable Energy Foundation, Professor Fred Helfont, Professor in Energy Planning, Aalborg University, Denmark, and Mr. Michael Rogel, CEO of Photon Consulting, and Dr. Hiroshi Takahashi, Research Fellow, Fujitsu Research Institute. From 4 o'clock, we are going to have a discussion session entitled New Energy Vision and Japan's Dawn. Academic Fellow of National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies, Dr. Kiyoshi Kurokawa, and also Mr. David Suzuki, Chairman of David Suzuki Foundation, and Professor Naohiko Jinno, Chairman of the Local Public Financial Council, and Mr. Thomas Kobeliel, Executive Board Chair of the JREF. We are planning to close the symposium at 5:10. I would like to ask for your kind participation until the end. Allow me to start the next session. Session 2, Distributed Energy Changes the Market. Now I would like to introduce Mr. Teruyuki Ono, Executive Director of the JREF. He will be the moderator for the session. Thank you for your kind introduction. As was introduced, my name is Ono. Good to be here. From the morning session, we had a very dense lectures, very productive, meaningful presentations and discussions. Those of you who were with us in the morning, you might be a little tired, but again in the afternoon, we have high-density sessions and the discussion session. In today's symposium, as you have just heard, we are talking about global energy turnarounds and Japan's path. Those of you who are with us since the morning, regarding this energy turnarounds in such countries as Germany and also in China, we are witnessing such turnarounds, and in other countries as well, major energy turnarounds. Not just the policies, but how energy is supplied has been dramatically changing, as you might have already found out. In Japan, concerning energy policies, again, 2 major considerations are given. Energy basic plan is being discussed, and the other is electricity system reform. Many discussions have been conducted, but as I followed the morning discussion, I felt that some are lacking here in Japan, one of which is the following. Why do we have to make such changes in the policy changes, this objective or the goal part? You might have realized the climate changes. These pose major issues. Globally, we are confronted with a major change. By switching the policy change, we have to create a low-carbon energy system. Otherwise, even for the survival of humans, it could pose a serious threat. And this has been one of the major background for the energy turnarounds, policy turnarounds. But in Japan, we don't seem to have such discussions in this particular arena. Not much focus has been made on this climate change. So this is one of the things I wanted to point out. There's another thing that's also missing in Japan's discussion, distributed power generation. We talked about how are we going to do about the nuclear or renewables. Those are something that we hear quite often. But there's another perspective. As represented by nuclear power, large-scale concentrated power generation. Well, it's somewhere located somewhere distant, and then it's distributed. But distributed energy, as represented by renewables, these are located more closely to the users. it's not just about the DS, the nuclear or renewables. From the large-scale centralized power generation to distributed energy, this approach or this perspective has not really been focused upon. In the afternoon session, we would like to again shed light on this area as well. Now, speaking of distributed generation or DG, it could be defined in various ways. Among the renewables, mega solar is large scale, then there's the offshore wind turbine or rooftop type of renewable. There are various kinds, and without giving detailed definition, from large scales such as the thermal power plant or nuclear power plant compared with such larger ones, these renewables are closer to the users. So from the perspective of spreading distributed generation, what kind of reforms are necessary? What kind of changes must be made to the system? So without further ado, and allow me to introduce the first speaker. I would like you to use 15 minutes each, and then we would like to have a discussion. First speaker, Mr. Eric Martino, please. Regarding the current situation about the renewables, you have actually written a white paper, but you have resided in Japan for long. You are very familiar with the Japanese situation. Eric, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here and talking about the future of distributed energy, distributed generation. There's no question in my mind that the future, in terms of power grids, in terms of heat supply as well, will be a combination, a complex combination of both distributed and centralized, and we're seeing the emergence of that balance in terms of both centralized and decentralized. It's no longer a question of technology. We have all the technologies we need. It's no longer a question of economics, even, really. There are so many profitable opportunities, and I think we're going to be hearing about those today. Have a very good panel for addressing all of these issues. It's really a question of, first, policy changes, electricity markets and regulation. It's really a question of business and finance and new forms of models. And it's really a question of the integration into power grids and how you balance that technically and what kinds of changes are necessary. I'm going to just give a brief overview, and then I'll talk about those issues in particular. So I think we're all aware that solar PV, rooftop solar, is one of the main forms of distributed generation we're seeing around the world. Here in Japan, there's been a huge growth in the market. We'll hear about that. Now, 3/4 of all the solar PV in Japan is rooftop solar. But we should not forget about other renewable technologies, biomass for heating and power locally, for small combined heat and power plants, biomass power as well as community scale wind power. I think we heard about the evolution, the progress of renewable markets globally earlier, but I think it's still worth pointing out that solar PV is becoming a very large share of the total global market. You can see the total power capacity globally, and solar PV, the yellow rather, is getting to be a fairly large share. By the way, the total wind power and solar PV capacity by itself, this is equal to the amount of nuclear power capacity globally. It's about 370, 380 gigawatts. That's equivalent to nuclear capacity globally. You can see in the EU there's about an equal amount of wind and solar, and that's also true in Germany, and in Italy there's actually twice as much solar as there is wind power. So solar PV has become dominant globally in terms of renewable energy markets and investment. I think we all understand the phenomenal growth rates we've seen in solar PV over the last decade. The market now is 40 times greater than it was 10 years ago. And a lot of interesting trends have emerged in terms of distributed solar PV. We used to call utility scale solar anything more than 100 kilowatts. But there have been so many installations above 100 kilowatts into the megawatt range. Now we track utility scale solar, so-called, in the range above 10 megawatts. Utilities themselves are investing in distributed solar. In fact, half of the solar in the U.S. was installed by utilities in 2012, and a growing proliferation of community-scale systems serving several buildings, not just individual rooftops, individual buildings, but community-scale systems, and a slowly emerging market for building integrated components, so solar PV integrated into building materials and components. In terms of investment, we've reached about $250 billion investment in renewable energy globally, and now half of that is in solar PV. So half of the total global investment in renewable energy is now for solar, and that's a very, very recent phenomenon, just the last few years. In terms of the future, I spent 2 years and I wrote this report, the Renewables Global Futures Report. You can download a copy in Japanese, translation from the ICEP website. And we looked at all of the recently published scenarios about the future of renewable energy, about 50 different scenarios that look 10, 20, 30, 40 years into the future. And these scenarios paint a very interesting picture of what renewables will look in the future. Here's just one example of this is a graph which shows percentage share of electricity from renewable energy in the future by 2030, and these shares tend to range 30 to 50% for a lot of published scenarios. So when Japan is considering a target of 30 to 35%, this is already an expectation or projection in a lot of other markets around the world for the year 2030. In fact, Germany has the target of 50% share of electricity from renewables by 2030. And scenarios are starting to portray a picture of distributed energy as part of these shares. For example, in the US, the Rocky Mountain Institute scenario called Reinventing Fire shows 80% of electricity in the US coming from renewable energy by the year 2050. And half of that is from distributed energy. Half of that is a series of interlinked microgrids with distributed solar, distributed wind, distributed biomass. So the US would be getting half of its renewable power in a distributed form. And other scenarios are starting to paint this picture in terms of distributed energy. If you look at the total projections for capacity of PV in the future, you find quite a wide range in terms of where we're at about 140 gigawatts actually as of last year, but a wide range of numbers in terms of where we're going in the next 15 years, let's say by 2030. But among the higher projections show that solar PV will increase by a factor of 15 by 2030. And we shouldn't forget shares of heat. I think that when we're talking about distributed energy, distributed generation, we have to remember we're not just talking about electricity, but we're also talking about shares of heating. And a lot of the scenarios actually paint pictures of large shares of our future heating supply, whether it's biomass or solar or geothermal heat supply coming from renewable energy. Now, as I now get to the issues for distributed generation, as I said, policy, business and finance, and grid integration or balancing. I think that there's not enough appreciation for the important role that policy is going to have to play in the future, and particularly here in Japan, where if you look at Japan's electricity sector, electricity market, so to speak, the restructuring that took place in most other developed OECD countries over the last 30 years really has not happened here in Japan. In fact, only Japan and Mexico have not restructured their electric utility sectors among all OECD developed countries over the last 30 years. And I think the policy changes that we can anticipate here in Japan really need to understand and respond to the growing markets for distributed generation in addition to centralized generation. So first of all, the guaranteed access and power purchasing, that's now part of the feed-in tariff here, so that pretty much exists. Now, that needs to remain. There's a lot of debate about feed-in tariffs in Europe and so on, but the essential element is this guaranteed access to be able to sell your power and guaranteed power purchasing. new market frameworks. This is really going to be very important in terms of how markets are structured, how to make the playing field, how to structure markets so that it's fair for both centralized and distributed generation in the most efficient way to achieve the greatest benefit of combining both. And I think that's really quite a large challenge in terms of the competition between distributed and central energy, competition between renewable energy and conventional energy, and also the capturing the true value of distributed generation. In other words, its ability to avoid investment in transmission distribution infrastructure because it's generation at the point of end use. This issue of stranded assets, I think, is a very important one. As more and more of the grid, and I think we'll hear about that from the other presenters as well, as more and more of the grid turns to distributed generation, particularly solar PV, we're going to run into the trouble, we're going to run into the problem that a lot of that some of the transmission and distribution assets, some of the generation asset will no longer be necessary. It will be so-called stranded asset. And how do you deal with that? Who pays for that? How do you handle a system in which there's been massive investment in assets, in centralized assets, that now needs to make way for the investment that's coming in distributed assets? And I think that's a major policy question that many countries now are facing around the world, particularly in Europe, countries like Germany. What happens to that existing asset? And finally, the last point here in terms of local wheeling of power. So this idea of being able to sell power to your neighbor, to transfer the power, to wheel the power over the local distribution lines, just in terms of peer-to-peer selling local energy systems, not at prices which are lower. The cost of sending your power over the grid at a price which is lower than sending it, let's say, across the country. The second major issue, and I think we'll hear more about this as well, is in terms of business and finance models. And a lot of very interesting new models coming along. We see new forms of companies, energy service companies, micro-utilities, new forms of energy service businesses, leasing, fee-for-service and prepaid systems, so that consumers don't have to fund the entire capital cost of a rooftop solar system, for example, up front. As well as, I mentioned peer-to-peer sales, being able to sell to your neighbor, community energy, community ownership, community investment, groups of citizens, small companies and community groups owning their own distributed generation assets. So a lot of very interesting business models. And I think the main innovation that we're going to see in the future, really the future of distributed energy, depends on these models, how these models evolve, how the innovation takes place. This is really where the innovation needs to be from now on, once there are adequate policy frameworks, and in parallel with the evolution of policy at the same time. And then finally, the third issue in terms of grid integration or stability. And the idea of having sort of autonomous micro-utilities or mini-grids, microgrids, sort of interlinked and all contributing together, sort of more of an internet concept for generation rather than a centralized model. And yes, there'll be energy storage at various levels, but I think one of the persistent myths about this integration issue is that you need energy storage to make this work, to make high shares of renewable energy work. And I think that that's not true. There are indeed about 10 different options that are already being used around the world today for balancing power grids that do not involve energy storage. And really one of the sort of key concepts here is flexibility, flexibility of generation and flexibility of demand, and in particular this idea of demand response. So the idea that you can actually adjust demand to match supply in real time using smart controls and contracts, and commercial and industrial companies can actually make money offering a flexible demand to the power grid, to the utility. The point is that all of these are already being done today in some place around the world, and I think that Japan really needs to recognize that it's not just about energy storage in terms of balancing high shares of renewables. Many other options do exist and are relevant for the situation here in Japan. And that's the grid balancing options. And lastly, yes, there are going to be technical issues in terms of having too much distributed generation. I think we're running into this problem now. There's already in Europe too much distributed generation, too much solar PV coming online. Utilities can't handle it. And how to handle this saturation that's occurring both at the local level on distribution grids and on a more national or regional level. So just to frame these issues, and I think we'll hear people talk more about these in the future. I won't dwell on this, but there's a lot of opportunity for integrating renewable energy at the building level, and this is really sort of the ultimate in distributed generation, both in terms of power generation, but also heat supply, passive heat storage, various forms of renewable heat. And you have to start with very efficient buildings, but you can imagine buildings becoming more autonomous and essentially becoming their own power sources. I'll end with just two more comments. One is that we're talking about a future in which all of this is profitable to a wide range of companies. It's not just about solar PV manufacturing, it's not just about wind turbine manufacturing, but a whole range of companies, including information technology companies, building material companies, even automakers integrating electric vehicles with renewables and so on. And finally, the report that I wrote, the Renewables Global Futures Report, has a whole series of great debates in it. And I think this final one here, centralized or decentralized power grids, number 5, is a question for us now. I think it's really going to be a complex combination of both. And then this question, number 6, will utilities lead, follow, push back, or perish, I think reflects the changes that we're going to have to see in the power sector in the future in terms of policy, in terms of business models, in terms of even our definition of what a power generator or a power utility is. So I look forward to hearing from our further colleagues. Thank you very much.
Eric, thank you very much for providing us with an overview and outline. So distributed energy, and of course the best example is Denmark. And we had some examples of the expansion of renewables in Denmark, and that on some days 100% of the electricity required is generated by wind in Denmark. So Denmark is a pioneering example for RE. So I'd like to call upon Fred Helpunkt from Aalborg University.
And thank you for being invited, and thank you to you for coming here. And it's incredibly important that a lot of people participate in this kind of discussion and learning, you could say, because it's the experience from the Danish experience is that government never moves unless a lot of people make the move. So that's so important that the whole experience of wind power in Denmark did not come because government wanted wind power. Distributed energy did not come because government wanted distributed energy. It came because of you could say a pressure, or more positively said, a dialogue between people knowing about these things. So that's so important that many people participate. And then the first thing I will just say very shortly is that it's also important when you start a journey to know that you are not on a blind alley. And that's also, we are still starting the journey in Denmark, despite we have 30% wind power. But it's so important to know that you can get 100% renewable energy have a system with this. And this is what we examined with a different university in a very big project called the CESA project. And you can see on this, anybody here who wants to know about it can just take this link, www.cesaplan.au.dk, and there you can see these reports, download them and read them. And the calculations in these reports are done for a system hour by hour, so that it shows that with fluctuating energy, you can still have 100% renewable energy and energy conservation. Because many would say, okay, what do you do when there's no wind? What do you do when there's too much wind? But you can handle these things in a system, and this is what this project also deals with. And this is our expertise at Aalborg University, my technical colleagues, I myself an economist. And I will not say much about this because it just shows that you can see the right ones are. This is 100% renewable energy, and in fact they are cheaper than just continuing using a lot of fuel. The green is fuel, and this is in fact biomass fuel. So you replace the green piece of fuel, import fuel, oil, coal and gas, with annual investment in capital. And you can see more about this. This is not my main purpose today to talk about this, but you can read in the report I just talked about before. So I'll go to the next. Danish energy policy, we've seen this several times, and in the 90s, around 1992, there was a 3, 4, 5, there was a big change to a more distributed system. And I'll say a little bit about this because I was asked to go in detail, although I know that maybe you can copy technical system, but you can very seldom copy policy, because policy background is different from place to place. The general thing about policy is that there is no general policy, you could say. You have to design it, tailor-made it for each country. But there are some main rules. But we could say if we take many of these distributed units were cogeneration units, it was people, for instance, 300 households in a village, or 400 households in a village. They had a district heating system. And then they got conditioned so that they could get a motor and get a cogeneration and produce electricity also. And people themselves, it was consumer-owned system, so people themselves decided that they wanted to make a cogeneration system. Or it was a municipality-owned system. People decided then in the municipality to make a cogeneration unit. So it simply was, and then, but then there was a policy that made this possible. And in fact, it is interesting because the Danish system was, in that time, a vertically integrated system. It was not a free market system. It was a vertically integrated system. And so it was within a vertical integrated system that this distribution, this development to distributed energy, in fact, happened. And these are just dots that say, you could say at a certain time, 88, we got standard gas prices when you wanted to buy natural gas for these power plants. And then in 1989, it became possible to get low interest loans when you wanted to build district heating. And then, then at the same time, you got a municipality guarantee for district heating systems so that you could borrow money cheaply. And then in 1991, there was a negotiation with the power companies, where the power companies were, you could say, in quotation marks, forced to give a long-term marginal cost for electricity sold to the grids from a cogeneration unit. So it was a price based on the long-term marginal cost in the power company system. So it's, and this made it, and then they got a certain carbon dioxide subsidy around 1 euro cent in 1993. But when all these crosses were ready, then we take off here, and then in a few years, I think in 3 or 4 years, around 400 cogeneration units were built. And it was not by central initiative, it was by now the conditions are okay, and then we can just start building it. And people ordered systems. And for a long time it was said by the electricity company that this was not possible, that the potential was very low, and then suddenly there was a built 2,600 megawatt, and that's much in Denmark. The power company said there was only a potential of 400 megawatt. And so reality, that's, as an economist, I know that technology is also political. because very often the technicians would say this is not possible, and afterwards you find out it is possible. This was a little bit about the distributed energy, and I can answer questions on this in detail, but I have very little time now. And this is the Danish wind power development, and you can see the policy goals for 2020. 6 years from now is 50%, and 2030 we had 33%. And the offshore is becoming an increasing share. This is just Denmark standing on Germany. And I could have you can go on the internet, and this is visualized. You can see exactly one day. This is the 14th of February, I think. And there you can see central power station produces that much wind power, and that produces in that day so much. And local, in this case, local CHP plants doesn't produce a lot. And then you have an exchange and so on, and the average carbon dioxide emission and so on. You can see this, and that's you can go and see this on the net on Energinet DK. If anybody wanted, I can give it the exact. I will not say much about this. This is just electricity prices, and this is from 2013, I think. Yes, first half 2013. And this is electricity prices for industry, and industry that has a consumption between 500 megawatt hours and 2,000. And what we can see from it is that Danish electricity prices, despite we have 30% wind, are lower than the average EU electricity prices. And so you cannot say that this is really putting a pressure on the Danish competitiveness. It's possible to have 30% wind and still have the electricity prices in Denmark below average in Europe. The new government from 2011, we always call it a new government, now it's 3 years old, but this was, they made an agreement with the rest of the parliament, I think it was 85%, so there should be 100% renewable energy in 2050, 100% renewable energy for electricity and heating by 2035, no coal on power plants and no oil for heating households by 2030, 50% wind in electricity 2020, 40% carbon dioxide reduction compared with 1990 in 2020. And then I will say a little bit about the present phase, because now we really have, as I mentioned this morning, sometimes the Danish electricity production by wind is 120% of the consumption. And if you then have 50%, then it will sometimes be the double. What are you doing with all this wind power? So the big change is from fossil fuel with renewable energy to renewable energy with fossil fuel, you could say. It requires a new infrastructure as we are going from stored energy to fluctuating energy. And there I cannot go in detail with this, but anybody having interest in it I can give you references, and I also sent a couple of articles to your organization. And but the most important thing here is that we never talk about smart electricity system. We always will talk about smart energy system, where you have a combination of electricity, heat, and gas, and then you combine this with transportation. And the secret is, you could say, that if, yes, I can say this is how, this is wind consumption, decentralized producers, and that's the central power station. That's the old system. You can have a little bit of wind in this system. It's very unflexible. You can just regulate a little bit on this, but you cannot have much wind. And then you have some decentralized producers. They are more flexible, so you can have a little bit more wind. And then you can have some heat storage, and then you can have a little more wind again, and that's how the system is today in Denmark. So you have central powers, you have decentral that are very fast in their regulation, and then you can store, if you have a lot of wind power, then you can sell it to the heat market, and then you can store it in a heat storage system, and then you can use it when you need the heat. That's a very quick way of saying it. And that's, you could say, when you need really more, then you have a lot. You have wind here, you have decentralized producers, you have some central power plant, not much, and you have heat and cooling pumps, and you have transportation here, and you have wind and syngas, and then you have the heat market here, and all this system is flexible. That's a smart energy system. And there we can really use a lot of Japanese technology in order to make this function. And because you need a lot of regulation, you need all these high-tech regulation technologies is also needed here. And so this is a message, you could say, and this is what is necessary today. That is to make a system where you coordinate electricity, heat, transportation, and also biogas. I will not go in detail with this, but this is just the renewable energy and transportation, where we have some wind, and we have some biomass, and then we have a gasifier and a hydrogen, and then we produce methanol for transportation. So when we talk about 100% renewable energy, it's also 100% renewable energy for transportation. Then policies for this. Clearly, we have talked a lot about feed-in system, and that's true. We need feed-in system, and because you need a reliable system. 1 minute, okay. I have 1 minute to point two. That's really a development of an intermittency infrastructure. That's important. That's something you should know is necessary on a long-term basis at least. And then I have some incentives. I have 1 minute left. I will say one thing about this. This is a demand, and this is a supply of different types of capacity. And you can see that if you go to a new big amount of wind power, then the electricity price goes down from there to here. And that's a problem, because wind power then commits economic suicide, you could say. Because the more wind power you have, the lower price on the market, and then it doesn't pay to have wind power and so on. So you have to change the market a little bit, and then you have to integrate heat and electricity. I think there you have an integration of heat and electricity. So then you change the demand curve by integrating heat and electricity, and then you get a higher price on wind power. And in that way, by integrating things, you avoid that wind power in this system commits, you could say, economic suicide. And you can read more. I have sent an article also to your organization, so I suppose this will be available for you. But so it is not a law of nature that it's not a law of nature that it's because of a specific market construction. But if you integrate wind, heat, and transportation and syngas, then you will not get these very low prices that kills wind power and also kills solar energy. So that's policies, and I'm sure you can get these the slides for this. So thank you very much.
ベルブルブンズありがとうございました。
Thank you very much. You have covered about 30 years of past, and I know it was very difficult to cover all that in just a 15-minute period. But we are only looking at 1 or 2% here in Japan, where we are not able to connect into the grid, whereas in Denmark there are several tens of percent being already connected to the grid. And then you have also talked about the different ways how you have enabled the wind power to be connected into the grid. And so we have a third speaker. We have from her photon consulting company, Mr. Michael Hergirl. Thank you.
Thank you for JREF for organizing, for everyone in Japan for coming to this event, and especially for the people on the internet who will be watching this inside Japan and outside Japan. What I want to talk to you about today is sports, because sports are much more interesting than energy. And the point I want to make is that in the English language, there's a traditional version of football and there is a new version of football. It is two very different sports with the same name. And in electricity, especially electricity in Japan, we have a traditional version of electricity and we have a new version of electricity, and it is two very different sports with the same name. And if you take only one thing away from this talk, I want you to really think about, do you want renewable energy? And if so, are you ready to become the next monopolist? Because that's what this sport is about. It's about monopoly. Let me share what we've learned. My background, I've spent more than 20 years in the energy sector. I spent 6 years at MIT focusing on the adoption of solar power in Japan. So I spent a lot of my time on the ground here trying to answer the question, why would anyone in Japan buy solar power? And I think we came up with a very good answer. And our consulting firm and our company serves about 25,000 companies in the solar sector and about 2,000 consulting clients, all solar companies. And this is the most important thing that we've learned. We've learned that today Japan has 1% of its electricity from solar, but that if it looks at other markets, the markets that are more advanced in terms of the adoption of solar, you would look at countries like Greece, Germany, and Italy, and in those countries they've achieved more than 5% of their consumption from solar. And you might think that's good. In our company's opinion, it's actually bad. And it's bad because it causes a lot of pain, because the sport is different. Let me show you what's happened as different markets achieve 5% of consumption. It's very systematic. If I were giving this talk 6 years ago or 7 years ago, I would give you the same exact data, except they would have been forecasts, and the forecasts turned out to be very largely correct. Germany went from being a very small solar power market, it ramped up, it reached 5%, and then it crashed down. Italy went from being a very small solar market, it ramped up, and it crashed down. Greece went from being a very small solar market, it ramped up, and it crashed down. They all did that at 5% of electricity consumption. The boom-bust cycle is very predictable, and it is very painful for anyone who is playing this sport. Let me share with you what happened in Germany. So in Germany, the historical trend has been, this is electricity consumption in Germany. It grew almost every year for decades, electricity consumption did. And then starting in the late 2000s, electricity consumption flattened, and then starting this past year, it went down. And it looks like it will keep going down. So you have decreasing volume of electricity consumption. In the same time, even though demand is going down, the supply of energy and of power is going up. And so the result is wholesale market prices have gone down a lot. This is the German wholesale market price for future years, 2015 and 2016. The price has gone from about 100 euros a megawatt hour to about under 50 euros a megawatt hour, down by about 50%. This is very predictable if you model electricity markets, very similar to what we would have expected 6 or 7 years ago. The result of this is that you have a sector where you have declining volume, declining wholesale market prices, limited retail price increases, and rising costs. And what that really means in energy is rising risk. Energy doesn't like risk. We like when our lights turn on. We like when our beer stays cold. We like when our refrigerator and our air conditioners are on. And the result has been that the companies responsible for managing that risk have been crushed. And you could say there are many factors driving this. We don't believe that to be true. We believe this is predominantly because of distributed energy causing a lot of pain for the centralized utilities. It's not just the market capitalizations, which is the equity side of the finance equation. It is also the debt side, which is much more important in energy. Debt finances most energy. We'll talk more about that. It does not finance most solar energy. It's interesting. But these are the credit scores. And basically, we don't need to go into the extreme details, but basically we've seen around the world, everywhere that solar goes rising up, the credit scores of the utilities go crashing down. And that will happen here even beyond the credit challenges that the utilities have today. So that's what's happened in Germany. What about here? So my PhD research, I came to Japan for the first part of my energy work in 1996. Really started looking at the solar power sector in 2001 and 2002. And I started studying the sector, and Dr. Martineau was one of the people who took me under his wing and taught me a lot about the sector. There are probably other people in this room who taught me a lot. I studied the Japanese adoption of solar, And what's happened since then is really impressive. The people who developed Japan's solar power policies and businesses should be really proud of themselves. This sector grew from $1 billion of revenue in 2007 to $25 billion of revenue last year, and this year we expect it to be about $28 billion of revenue. Just to put that in more personal terms, please take $220 out of your pocket this year, because that's what the average Japanese person will spend on solar power this year. That's the average for the country. It's very impressive. The solar companies in Japan, and I'll talk more about, because we serve every major solar company as a client, I won't talk about any specific company, but I would say the large Japanese companies have done remarkably well recently, going from about $4 billion of revenue 2 years ago to about $8 billion this year, and turning from negative operating profit to about $1 billion of operating profit this year. Really impressive turnaround, but I'll talk more about them in a minute, because in some cases, these are companies that are playing the wrong sport. The installers, very impressive. If you look at the price of a solar power system in Japan, you might say it's a very high-priced system, at $3.42 for a commercial system price. And this is based on going out and really doing on-the-ground research with hundreds and hundreds of installers around Japan over the past year and a half. And basically what we see is that the price of a solar system in Japan is below the price in California, New York, Arizona, Massachusetts, many places in the United States, and many places around the world. It's not as low as Germany, but it's lower than many other places. And when we break down that price, what we see is that it's remarkable. One of the most surprising statistics in the solar power sector is that installing, the soft cost of installing, that includes all of the work that the local electrician does to acquire a customer, design a system, procure the hardware, permit, financing, contracting, installation, inspection, warranty, all of that is done for 30 cents per watt. That's less than 10% of the system cost. It is a remarkably low number. We install systems and we deal with people who install, companies that install systems around the world. Remarkably low. The electricians in Japan do a very, very good job at very low cost. Now, what they're not getting is low-cost hardware. And this is really, in my opinion, one of the real tragedies of the Japan solar power market is that so much money is spent on the hardware without any real benefit for the installer. And so the big companies, Sharp, Kyocera, Mitsubishi, even the silicon producers, Tokuyama, et cetera, they're really taking a lot of cash out of this market in a way that isn't sustainable, because they're taking it for the hardware, which is a one-time sale. The installer has to keep their electrician, typically a small electrician business, going for a long time. So the large suppliers get a lot of money for what they're doing. That's great. But what it does is it invites especially Chinese competitors to come into this market. Now, today, that's okay, because effectively the installers are making a profit, and a pretty nice profit. They're basically making somewhere on the scale of a 20 to 25% operating margin on their installations. Very attractive relative to other markets. But when you talk to them, and this is based on talking to more than 600 electricians in person through Japan, they have 4 things to say. Number 1, traditional Japanese electricity companies will be bankrupted and nationalized due to the rise of distributed energy. That is almost unanimous among electricians. Number 2, Japanese solar manufacturers do not make efforts to satisfy the core needs of end customers or the electricians and installers. They're dissatisfied with the suppliers, which is why they're buying more and more Chinese product. Number 3, they say storage is essential for their businesses. It's essential for the end customers, but that the suppliers keep supplying the wrong storage product, that the storage is low enough cost and low enough price today, but that the suppliers want to supply very big storage units when what they ask for are small storage units. They don't get that. We can talk more about that. Overall, these electricians have an expectation of major challenges ahead, that they believe that the downturn is coming in the Chinese solar power market within the next 3 years, maybe within the next 2. And so we agree. We think solar is going to keep growing, and what's going to happen is that solar will reach 5% of consumption in Japan no later than 2018, maybe 2016. And the result is the same thing that happened in Germany and Italy and Greece, is that we're going to see a crash in the market. We'll see a downturn. This is electricity consumption in Japan. We will see a downturn in total electricity consumption, especially from centralized sources. We will see a decrease in the spot price of electricity, and the spot price of electricity for wholesale markets in Japan today is a very small market, but it's going to grow a lot in the next few years as the market starts trading a lot more. And that's really going to be painful to see that price drop 50% is our best estimate. And we've been fairly remarkably good at forecasting the wholesale prices based on solar penetration rates. And the question is, whether you're KEPCO or any of the other 10 large electricity companies in Japan, are you going to follow the pattern of the Europeans with their much lower market capitalizations and much lower credit scores? So overall, what we see is a solar power sector that is going to generate about $28 billion in revenue this year, and within 3 or 4 years will be cut in half or less. And the reason we believe that is based on historical pattern. It's also based on watching the Japanese market go through the same cycle in 2003, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, when it really struggled as other markets competed and really beat the Japanese market in bids for building their solar markets. But the thing that we've observed across markets that is maybe most surprising and most dangerous is that we have many solar power systems going into this market, and what we see is a pattern across all major solar markets. The markets are constrained, then they go into a period of explosive, very fast growth, then they get to that 5% mark and they crash, and then with the crash, the government and the utilities really start to fight and claw back some of the benefits they've given to those systems. We call that retroaction. And we believe that will come to the solar companies in Japan and to the owners of solar systems in Japan. It will really be a challenge that we see in other markets. And so when we talk about winning, regardless whether we're talking about football in its new form or football in its traditional form, the core point is winning requires overcoming many obstacles. And if you want to win in electricity, you've got to be ready to address problems. The core is that the traditional electricity companies, no one believes that they're going to be able to really address the problems that are coming. They're not going to be able to finance distributed infrastructure. They're not going to be able to finance distributed storage and controls. They're not going to do a whole bunch of things that many, many people would like to see them do. They're stuck. And they were stuck in Germany and they were stuck in Italy. So this really means that the new companies that are coming into the market, they sit on an opportunity but also a challenge to really, how do they win? How do they build the new monopoly? How do they build a new empire? And we can talk about this more, perhaps offline, but we basically believe that there are 7 steps that every winning solar company will follow in wealthy markets. We can talk about those 7 steps at another time. But the singular point is, if you're measuring and you're thinking about solar power and you're a chemical company, you might think in dollar per watt or dollar per square meter terms. You might think in dollar per watt terms if you're a manufacturer or a customer. You might think in cents per or dollar per kilowatt hour terms if you're buying electricity or you're buying a solar power system. None of those metrics predict who wins. The only metric that predicts who wins is the financing term of really driving IRR spreads, internal rate of return spreads above discount rates. So it's a financing game. And I think that this community, including JREF, but really all of us in this community, I think there are 3 things that we can do, and I'll close on these 3 points. We can get better at quantifying the impacts more thoroughly, not just of renewable energy, which I think we've done a very nice job of today, but across the broader electricity sector, the broader energy sector, and broader society, number 1. Number 2, I'd really like to see more people from energy finance here next year, talking to how to address some of the challenges of really enabling continuing financing of distributed energy infrastructure over time. And we can teach other markets, share the patterns that we're seeing in Japan. We've brought foreign experts here. Please bring what we're learning back to those foreign experts outside of Japan. And so I'll close with this. It really comes down to what sport you're playing. But if you think that you're playing traditional football and that you can kick a ball and not get hit in the face, if you really believe that, we believe that you're going to get surprised. And we believe that there are many companies in the Japan solar sector that aren't ready for the hits that are coming. And so we would say, please be ready because a fight for monopoly is here.
Thank you so much, Mr. Rogoli. If we look at those countries, they go to 5%, 8% penetration, and then crash or decline. Those are what has happened in advanced countries. But it could happen to Japan. In the morning session, several people pointed out in Japan, we are now a latecomer in terms of renewable energy. But there are some good things about being a latecomer. We can learn from the predecessors. We can learn from those people who are ahead. So without emulating those things in order to continue the penetration of the renewables, I hope that we can have a discussion. The first, about the Japanese situation, I would like to call upon Dr. Takahashi from Fujitsu Research Institute to share with us your view. Thank you. In the JREF's International Symposium, I had a chance to participate on several occasions, but then I followed a similar pattern. I get to see people who I don't really get to see in Japan. You invite many overseas experts, and from the morning you just cram us with the overseas examples, and this reminds us how behind we are here in Japan. But then, at the last minute, I am called upon to say something about what Japan is going to do. And then again, I think that's the road that has just been given to me today as well. And my presentation is entitled Reforming Japan's Electricity System for Distributed Generations. And DG, or distributed generation, is increasing in Western countries as well. But what do we do regarding this DG? And many discussions have already taken place. But I would like to share with you my view using this one slide. Electricity system or power system. I think there are two key factors. First, network. How effectively can we use the network? And the blue y-axis shows that approach. And the second is market, because electricity is transacted. So how do we use the market power, and which is shown on the x-axis in red? And in Japan, if you look at the electricity system, it's in the third quadrant right here. Vertically integrated, or vertical integration, were the expressions you heard many times today. And we do have that kind of expression, similar or equivalent expression in Japanese as well. And in principle, this is monopoly, and the power market cannot be utilized under the monopoly. Now, on network, within the region, network power can be used, but that network power across regions cannot be used because it's within a certain region. And that's the structure of the vertical integrated system. Now, I am not criticizing it unilaterally, just worldwide. There was a time when the vertical integrated system was the most effective. However, in the 1990s in the United States and also in Europe, power market liberalization started by using the market force. Well, with the competition, the electricity price could go down. So following that very simple line of thinking, if you look at this right hand, perhaps to the fourth quadrant, there was a shift. What happened to the network then? Obviously, in order to compete, as was mentioned, transmission network should be available to those peers in the industry, to competitors. So the liberating the network on a fair basis, and that was done, opened. But when it comes to the availability of the power in broader areas, now that was not really handled appropriately. But that's my understanding. But in the 1990s, in Denmark, for instance, renewable energies with variable output was introduced more and more to the grid. And timing-wise, that happened almost at the same time. Interestingly, and in that case in Denmark, 30% of power is exported and the same amount is actually imported. And that's symbolic, because the network power should be utilized, should be harnessed even more. So perhaps there was a shift, upward shift in this chart. For transmission network, renewables should be actually incorporated on a priority basis. And then that's just a region, even across borders, the wider operation should be done. And that kind of a mission was added. On the other hand, feed-in tariff, to be certain, yes, there are some issues concerning FIT. It's not particularly based on the so-called market principle, as you know. There is a transmission company, and they must buy this particular power at a certain fixed tariff, and that doesn't mean that it's done fully on market force basis. I'm not critical about this. For renewables, this is a variable output, and in order to incorporate this into the grid, it was necessary. That's why perhaps the FIT was used. But for FIT to enjoy success, and then the renewables 20, 35, 50 basis, and on the kilowatt-hour basis, when 50% is from the renewable, then further new thing must be done in the first quadrant. I call this smarter network system. The first quadrant, and I said that autonomous and distributed system is the expression that I used. Now, network can be used, obviously, but the area must be widened. And we had this discussion at the noon. In Europe, by state, there is a transmission company, but across states, across national borders, the integration perhaps should be pursued. There is another thing, the power of market, including renewables. The power of market should be harnessed and utilized. In Europe, roughly speaking, there are 3 power exchanges. Amongst them, the integration should be pursued. And the capacity market, but what was it transacted at by kilowatt hour? Well, kilowatt hour value should also be used. And demand response. Consumers' behavior should be incorporated into the market to tackle the power source with variable output. And European and some Americans are having a difficult time trying to tackle these issues. So concerning the power system, this is what's been happening on the world scale. And we are still right here. We are here. Now, what are we going to do? For stable supply of power, vertically integrated system was pursued, and that's what people said. But as you know, after the March 11 earthquake, there was a huge blackout. So what happened to this vertically integrated system? Did it really benefit? Did it really contribute to the stable supply of power? Because for one, variable output, distributed power, maybe there was too little distributed power, because not just because of the stoppage of the nuclear power plants, there are so many large-scale thermal power plants on the Pacific coastline. They all stopped, and that's why we couldn't prevent blackout from happening. So distributed generation, the smaller scale ones, if they are connected, maybe as an entire system, we can make the entire system more robust, and that's been voiced as an opinion after March 11. The other is interregional network. Power is just like cars or a railway. Economic efficiency should be higher if it covers the wider area. Now, this is nothing new, but we realize this because in the western part of Japan, there was a surplus of power, whereas in the eastern part of Japan, we couldn't get that particular power from the western part of Japan. As you can see, I'm pretty sure you're familiar with this. For instance, between the west and the east, the pipe is thin, and also between Hokkaido and the main island, the interconnection is not really big enough, but even that the existing interconnection line was not particularly used. So third, so if there's the lack of supply, then we have to somehow work on demand, so the plant, the outage, or instruction and order to restrict the use of power. So these were all measures lacking flexibility. So we again question this. Well, if there is a lack of supply, the prices should be increased. And this should be done first because of IT. Perhaps using IT in a smart manner, we can do this demand response. Then there was a serious discussion at the government council. The electricity system reform was finally discussed. This is a roadmap available for that purpose. As the first step, last year the law was already revised. Wide area system operator should be established, for instance. And in this year, because with the amendment of the law in 2 years' time, the retail will be liberalized. And in the next 2 years, again, the law amendment from 2018 to 2020, legal unbundling should be pursued. And those are the decisions that have been made now. Will it result in a good performance? Do we Japanese have to really address these issues? Now, about the network and the market. These are the key factors for the future electricity system. So first, I would like to look at the network side. What are the keys? Unbundling. This is grid unbundling. For Japan to address this unbundling between generation transmission, there are two major alternatives, and we must be aware of these two. One is this move. In European, this is what happened in the European countries, unbundling and trying to make the transmission network neutral, independent. Europeans value this ownership in this regard. Transmission owners should be different from the power plant owners. Otherwise, this unbundling will not be fair. The ownership should be separated. And that's in the background of TSO, transmission system operators. You say UK, Spain, and many Nordic countries, they have established TSO, independent transmission companies. Now, as a compromise, there is ITO. Separating ownership totally can be a bit radical. So by creating a holding company as a subsidiary, having this transmission company. So this is a legal separation. The one example is France. Japan also has decided to follow the ITO style of unbundling. The Americans, again, had a different line of thinking. It's important to have this organization, but rather than being too particular about the ownership, perhaps you can just carve out the operation side of the grid and ISOs. In California, concerning transmission network, they are still owned by the power generation company, but grid operation is done by independent system operators, ISOs. So what are the good things about it? Operations are separated, but for wider operation, the ISO can make a contribution. One example is the RTO, such as PJM, across the states. For wider operation, the ISOs and RTOs can be flexible. So that's the American way of handling. In Japan, we have decided to go to this direction, but in addition to that, being able to operate in a wide area is important, because if we just do unbundle and create 10 additional companies, it would not be good enough. So we need to pursue this wider area. So OCTO becomes important. This is the Organization for Nationwide Coordination of Transmission Operators, OCTOs. After legal separation, then power companies would look like this. As I said before, if there will be so many grid companies. So as a horizontally, the connector, the OCTO should be established. This is positioned as a promoter of the operation. So how strongly can they enforce this integration? That's another point. The other point is a market. The market has not really been functioning in Japan. We do have a JPEX, the spot market. Their share of the market is just less than 1% of the total consumption of power. In principle, it's the electric power companies. They monopolize with their long-term contracts about kilowatts. the supply, because of the obligation, supply obligation of utilities, they have to do this in the kilowatt market. So what's happening in the European market? Of course, spot market must be expanded, and also futures market. Futures market must be used, otherwise such the variable risks cannot be taken. Even more importantly, kilowatt hour balancing in Japan. We do not have this balancing market, and this balancing market must be established. And capacity market, as kilowatt market, capacity market must be established as well. In Japan, we have a lot of pumped hydro. This can be incorporated, and demand response must also be incorporated. And these are some of the issues we are faced with. This is the last page. Going forward, we have more and more DG, this distributed power generation, and based on the assumption, there are many things that we must do. For OCTO, is OCTO given a lot of authority? Is it just a coordinator? If it's just a coordinator, it doesn't bid very well. About the legal separation per se wouldn't be sufficient. That's how the Europeans are thinking about how to make sure that this will have a wide area operation. How can we actually handle this ownership ban and power market, power exchange, quantitatively? How can it be expanded? And in terms of quality, how can we design the capacity market? In doing this, independent regulators. We do not have independent regulators, which is a major problem, and they will be established next year. That much has been decided, but the detail is not clear. Again, we would like to learn from the world experience so that we can create a better distributed system, distributed new system. This concludes my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank
you very much, Dr. Takahashi. You have given us a overall picture of where Japan is positioned out of the global perspective. So we have heard different points, and we would like to continue. But we can't cover all points, unfortunately, due to a lack of time, but we would like to focus on certain points. And in the morning session, towards the end, Ms. Obayashi has mentioned about the new energy plan. And now the cabinet is discussing that, and we'll be seeing certain directions for that. And there were more than 19,000 comments made, and they wanted to see more and more use of RE. But it seems that when we look at newspapers, it seems that comparing with the energy strategy, we may not be able to expect something dramatic to take place. So, of course, we'll do our best and try to give proposals on better policy approaches. But now we have the centralized government system, and for distributed energy in RE, we may not see total transition. Now, if you have this pessimistic view, let's say that the government's attitude does not have a dramatic transition, what can we do in that circumstance? The business sector and the local community, what can we do to try to pursue with energy policy is what we would like to consider. And we would like to hear from past experiences as what could be done. Eric, do you have anything to start off with, please?
Well, thank you. I guess I would make 2 points, and the first is, the idea that distributed energy is too expensive, or in terms of the cost. If you look at the value of a kilowatt hour of electricity in the middle of the day, that the value of that kilowatt hour can be very high. It's peak demand time. In some utility grids in the U.S., that kilowatt hour might be valued at $1 or 100 yen, compared to a normal kilowatt hour, which might be valued closer to 10 cents or 15 cents. And so we're talking about distributed energy and solar PV in the middle of the day providing very high value to the power grid, to the society, essentially, at peak times. So from a social point of view, it's very profitable. It's very efficient, economically speaking, but not from the point of view of the utility. The utility company is losing revenue if people are generating their own power on their rooftop, and the utility is losing revenue against its fixed assets of transmission, distribution, and generation. So we have to distinguish between what's in the interest of the utility company with the fixed assets and what's in the interest of society for an efficient system that captures that value. The second point I would make is in terms of recognizing the role of city governments and local authorities and local community groups for renewable energy and for distributed energy solutions. There are hundreds and hundreds of cities around the world that have enacted policies and incentives and programs for local renewable energy systems. And you can find examples pretty much everywhere in the world now, particularly in the US and Europe, many cities. There's about 1,600 cities in the EU Covenant of Mayors, and they're doing so many things. Some cities even require solar PV or solar thermal hot water on all new building construction of a certain type. Some cities are engaging or supporting green power purchasing. That's buying power which is specifically labeled as coming from renewables. City investments in renewable energy on public rooftops, public properties. Some cities have started to finance renewable energy projects locally. The city of Berkeley in California in the US, they established a series of municipal bonds to directly provide finance to households, consumers, to invest in local distributed energy solutions, and they pay back those bonds through their property tax assessments. It's a very innovative program that's been replicated around the US. Many cities have targets for share of renewable energy or the number of rooftops or the number of square meters or various types of investments, and then enact all kinds of policies or programs or even facilitate a private sector activity to meet those targets. So I think and Japan cities really have been leading this themselves for the last 10 years. A lot of the innovation in Japan for renewable energy has come at the local level and has been directed at the more distributed forms of energy.
Thank you very much, Eric. It is true that about a week ago at Asahi newspaper, I believe, there was an article, Beyond 311, I think about 34 or so of municipalities have started and heightened their target for renewable energy. And JREF and these municipalities have memorandums, and we have councils set at large cities as well to proceed with these activities. So, Mr. Elvund, you talked about the vertical integration system, and that distribution method has continued on with that. How did it develop in Denmark? Can you elaborate a bit more on that, please?
Yes, the Danish system developed, in fact, as I mentioned, in an integrated system. It was totally consumer-owned from bottom to top. All the power companies were also consumer-owned. And then the government and the power companies, you could say, agreed, the power company on a certain pressure that they had to pay a certain amount of money per kilowatt or long-term marginal cost, and it was calculated. I myself was one of the people who participated in the calculation. And after this rule, long-term marginal cost, and you could do this tomorrow in principle in Japan, decide that new distributed units should have the long-term marginal cost of the present system. And this can be found out what this is exactly. So this is, you could say, technically possible in the present. You don't have to wait on independent TSOs, for instance, although I think this is a very important thing to have, but you don't have to wait until you have this. You can have this only on one rule. When you are an independent producer, you should have the long-term marginal cost of the present system. And then I would say, I don't know, can I say more than this? It's a time for just another comment. Because I cannot understand why we think so much about the losses of the utilities, big utilities. And we should pay the losses. Why shouldn't we then distribute the gains when they had a lot of gains? Because they, at least I know the German power companies, and I myself was a shareholder through my pension fund in this, and they had really for a long time increasing shareholder values. And nobody talked about, because of these high rises, we should give some of this shareholder value to the public. And now the shareholders, the value is decreasing, and then you start talking about, some people talk about that it's a pity we have to pay them for losses, share losses. I think some gains and some losses, and that's how it is in the market system. But the first thing was that, and then the third thing is that I think it's very important that you give a local initiative and local ownership, even the consumers in an area, ownership to the distributed energy units, so that they are not only accepting it, but having the initiative. That's really important. So not just accept, but participate and develop it themselves. This was one of the secrets in the Danish development, that you have a local ownership and local initiative. Yeah. There are many others, but I don't have time for it now.
So local ownership is something that you mentioned. Are we talking about citizens? Are we talking about the municipality holding the shares?
In the city where I live, Aalborg, that's a city of 120,000 inhabitants. Then the municipality owns the power, owns the district heating system, and they don't own, in fact, they don't own the power company. They just are thinking of buying a power company just now. They hope they can get it cheap from Vattenfall. And the most of these small units I showed on the map, and that's typically a small city with 1,000 inhabitants, for instance. This would be very often consumer owners. The consumer owned the district heating system, and they just invest a little bit more than they own a cogeneration unit. And then they meet every year to a general assembly and decide who is board of this. And then they decide how to run this district heating company. And this is very, very well established methodology, you could say, in many places of the world, and especially also in Denmark. So they started it. And the same with wind turbines. The initial stages, it was very often cooperative wind turbine association. And there's a lot more to say about this, but my time is restricted, so I also have to stop talking. I could talk a long time about this.
Thank you. So in Japan, of course, community power is expanding. So I do hope that there'll be more and more community-held solar and wind. So what would you talk a little bit more, Michael, about from the business point of view, what's happening?
Let me not talk from the business point of view, but about the financing point of view. So what capital in Japan went from $1 billion invested into solar to $25 billion a year invested into solar. Wow. That's incredible. That's what we want to protect. Most of that money was not spent in Tokyo. Most of it wasn't spent in big cities. Most of it was spent and invested in very small places. So to echo what both of the previous people said, this is very local first. And what you need to bring is a simple structure of financing, which is what the feed-in tariff does now. It brings a simple structure of financing. If you can continue that simple structure of financing, but just do it locally, that's what JREF should be doing. We should be sitting down and really talking seriously about how do we bring a simple structure of financing to local towns that have high electricity price and a desire to build local jobs. But I want to add one thing from the business side on top of that. That only seems to be sustainable if you're willing to have the end customer pay the electrician a fair price, meaning a profitable price to get them out of bed into the roof and to do the installation and take good care of your roof and your solar system and your batteries. And they have to be willing to pay a fair price to their manufacturers, and the manufacturers need to be willing to pay a fair price to their chemical feedstock suppliers. And the reason this is so important is that if you insert risk in an energy finance system, it isn't sustainable. So what the feed-in tariff has done in Japan has gotten rid of the risk. And that's what's enabled a 25-fold increase in financing of systems, is that very simple, easy to understand, low-risk financing structure. You need that. Do it locally. And make sure that you're really paying everyone along the chain a fair price. Otherwise, you're inserting risk in your own supply chain, and it will fall over on itself. It's not sustainable.
Thank you. So Takahashi-san, I think you'll be the last to speak again. I think it's the pattern that you've faced every time. So having heard overseas experts mention what's happening in the various areas, and so from the locality, from the enterprises, what do you think we should do next? Thank you. I'll try to summarize. So the government's direction and the direction of the populace is different. And it can happen. It frequently does. So, and of course, one way of going about it is to change the policy of the government. But for the time being, there are differences between the two. So there are players who are not protagonists in the past who could become protagonists. We had various opinions from the variety of experts, and one player who was not a protagonist and who was not involved in energy or electricity business, they could become involved in RE. And it's possible to sort of utilize RE to this extent. We could get more and more enterprises to do that. Another way would be municipalities. So for the long time, we'll be talking about decentralization and giving more mandate to the prefecture or the local municipalities. But here again, because of this energy shift, energy paradigm shift, perhaps in this field of energy, we should give a little more mandate to the localities. For example, in the city, in Nagano Prefecture, has moved forward with community power, and they've been moving for rent-a-roof. So therefore, in a way, according to the laws and the regulations, it was not possible to rent a roof for the PV panels. But however, this city, the mayor changed all the rules. Now it is possible to rent the roofs of the gymnasiums or the nurseries or kindergartens, etc. So therefore, the municipalities were not the protagonists in the past. But I think from now on, it is possible for them to become the protagonist. And another protagonist that we'll be missing is the consumer. And the consumers, including the companies that consume, I think that's another area, another player that become the consumer. I think 3 years or 5 years from now, at least in terms of the power market, the consumer would get freedom of choice, I hope. And there again, it's possible to express your opinion. And of course, demand responses. So at peak times, you're requested to cut off your power, and that's another way to conserve energy. So, and in community power and RE funds have become rather popular, and that is one way in which the individual can make investments in RE. That's one way to indicate your choice. So I think one by one, we should increase the number of areas where opinions can be expressed. So consumers, companies, municipalities, I think they themselves have to express their opinions. So anyone with an opinion, any last message?
Well, I think we've covered this, and I think if you read the news, the press, if you see what utilities in the U.S. and Europe are saying, if you see what CEOs and industry experts are saying, it's very clear. Everybody is talking about how utility power sector utility business models, utility finance, the whole structure of electricity markets has to change, and it's going to change. There's no question on the minds of many leading thinkers and executives that this is happening, and I think Michael Rogel will be the first to say, I think he's written the book on this actually just recently, and it's very clear that this is happening. And I think Japan is well behind the curve, so to speak. If the rest of the world is thinking of how to upgrade already to an iPhone 6 or 7 perhaps, and Japan is still starting with an iPhone 2, there has to be a catch-up. There has to be a rapid evolution to really catch up with what's happening in the rest of the world. And I think that's the real challenge here, but I think it can happen. Yeah.
I think that it's very important also for the whole communication to cope with a very simple question that I think many people will have in their minds, and arguments against renewable energy will also have this in their minds, the simple question of what do we do when there's no wind, no sun? What do we do when there's too much wind, too much sun? And you really have to cope with this question and to communicate it. And I think you need to make a sort of energy plan for Japan, and also in your organization maybe showing how you deal with these problems. Because otherwise you'll always meet this very simple argument, and it's prevalent in many areas, and it's very easy just to say it, and you have to show that this problem is and can be handled. And we know this can be handled, and if any in your organization want it, you can also, we have an energy plan model which is free of charge and which is open access, and where you calculate for every hour and put in the type of the profile of wind and sun in a specific area, and then see how should the system look like in order to cope with these fluctuating energy sources. So we have to look this question in the eyes and be able to communicate on this. And in order to do this, cope with this, you have to integrate. You cannot just deal with electricity. You have to integrate electricity, heat, transportation, and also the production of based on syngas. If you do this, you can cope with it. So the next step, and that's also for communication with everybody, is to be able really to communicate this, that this is not at all a blind alley. You can have 100% renewable energy system if you integrate the different sectors of energy. That's the main message from me today also.
ありがとうございました。ドルゴさん、じゃあ最後に一言何か。
Thank you, Mr. Hirogo. Would you like to close with a final comment?
So this morning we opened up with Mr. Son-san giving us a video message, and we don't know if he's going to watch this video message, but if he were, I think we owe him a degree of thanks for taking a network that was fairly monopolized in Docomo and opening it up and bringing competition to it and figuring a way to effectively take out the old network provider. And that skill set of bringing the financing to a network that didn't exist and breaking in when no one would have believed it were true. I would say what we want to do next is to sit down and put a group of financiers, local energy technologists, and business people in the room together, which this group is more than capable of bringing together. And in 2 days, we should have a structure of this is what the deal looks like if you want to finance and build responsible energy systems. This isn't 2 years of work, it's 2 days of work. The expertise is here, and the one piece that's missing, from my opinion, is just what's the structure of the financing so you can have a contract on it. So to me, that's very exciting, because what it means is that if we go out 1 year from today, then the next time we sit down could be very action-oriented and not just trying to understand.
ロルゴンさん、ありがとうございました。
Thank you, Mr. Rogo and Mr. Takahashi. I guess you have the last word. I thought that you had forgotten about me. So there are 2 points that I'd like to make, and that is, I have been involved in the energy policy ever since the 11 earthquake. And there's one thing that I have always repeatedly said, and energy, you should be able to choose the system. And so there's been a lot of discussion as to whether you could go to nuclear or you go to renewables. But choosing one or the other it does not mean that nuclear power generation is going to be simply replaced by renewables. It doesn't. It is not that simple. The entire structure will have to be changed. So the mechanism would need to be changed. And unless you do that, you will not be able to have that new type of electricity generation. That means that there's going to be a difference made in the organization, the society. So there's a lot of discussion about restructuring, and that is precisely what needs to be done as we shift to another type of energy. And another discussion that has not been addressed too much by the media in recent time, and I thought that this is just taken or just started. And in Germany, it was stemmed from the Chernobyl accident, and it was in the year 2000 that they decided that they will phase out nuclear. And with the Premier Minister Merkel, we thought that maybe they will change the shift, but actually, after 25 years in Germany, they have ended up with a consensus about the phase out of nuclear. So that means that we have only started that process, and now we have seen the result of the gubernatorial elections here. But I think this is something that we should be continuing on, because we believe that we need to continue with the discussions with the future revisions. And so in Mr. Bratter's keynote speech, he had mentioned the shift from the fixed line telephones to mobile telephones. And so if you look at the communications sector, you have seen the shift from wired communication to wireless, and then to the use of smartphones. And so I hope that we'll be able to see such changes taking place. Now we should be looking at financing, how the industry should be structured, but we believe that that is in fact possible. And so with that, I'd like to suggest that we close this session, and let's have a round of applause for the panel members. Thank you very much, Mr. Ono, the moderator, as well as the panel members for your participation. And let's have another round of applause for all of the speakers. So that concludes session 2 of the conference, and we will now be taking a coffee break. The next session will begin at 4 p.m. That will be session 3. And as for the material used today in presentations, they will be posted at our website from the foundation. And for the questionnaires, please submit that to our staff members as you exit the hall. And we will also be collecting the simultaneous interpretation receiver as you exit the hall also. So please do not take the receivers out of this hall with you.